Today's episode is brought to you by HERdacity. HERdacity is a nonprofit inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. For resources, networking opportunities, and a strong community of women, visit HERdacity.org to learn more.
Welcome to HERdacious, a podcast for audacious women. Hello, lovely listeners. Welcome back to HERdacious, the podcast for audacious women looking to make some career moves. And HERdacious is one of those amazing resources to help you do it. My name's Lorelei Gonzalez, the happy host of the show. And today we are going to be talking about communicating your personal and professional values. To assist us in this conversation, I have a high energy curriculum creator and wellness coach, the founder of Seek United, Brianna Harrington.
Hi, Lorelei.
Hello, Bri. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. How about you?
Most excellent. Most excellent. I'm really excited to kick off this conversation because talking about values seems really interesting.
I agree. I think it's something that we really need to spend a little bit more time thinking about in the U.S. And so I'm so excited to get to talk to you and your audience today.
Thank you. We're excited to have you here. So what do you mean when you advocate for communicating your personal and professional values? What does that really mean to us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, on a daily basis, are you really living aligned to the values that you've thought about? Along with that, are you overly concerned with what other people's reactions might be if you truly lived aligned to what you valued? Or are you doing that without any thought of how other people would go about it?
Oh my gosh, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to fall into this idea like, oh yeah, people definitely know what my values are. But when you start to actually examine like who you are and what's important to you, you might start to recognize that, hey, you don't actually align with all of the friends or relatives or coworkers. And you might be holding back who you are in order to be accommodating for somebody else.
All right. Interesting thing to ponder on. Help us better understand why communicating our personal and professional values is important, especially communicating those values throughout our careers.
Absolutely. So I'm a big advocate that our personal and professional lives are intertwined. And so you can't be speaking your values in your personal life and then just leave them at the door when you go to work. And you can't expect people to think that, oh, these are my professional values, but then my personal life, I have a completely different set. So they're intertwined and you're going to have to bring them with you if you want to show up as your most authentic self. When you live aligned to your values, you end up having incredible energy. And this is because you're not being constantly drained by trying to be a version of you that really isn't you. So you'll sleep better, you'll take better care of yourself, find your flow, opportunities will open up in a whole different way than if you just are kind of being half of who you are. When we think about how we're living in the US, we're actually one of the most unhealthy populations in the world.
What do you
so
mean?
We're
like the richest population in the world? How the unhealthiest? Oh.
Yeah. You know, it's absolutely wild. One of the most overstressed, we're overmedicated, we're obese countries in the world. And on top of all of this, we have the highest rate of avoidable death.
Oh my gosh.
So that means that when we look at like how people are dying in the US, right? The top leading causes of death, heart disease, cancer, respiratory diseases, accidents, which includes like drug overdose, Alzheimer's, diabetes, they're all linked to lifestyle choices. So they're often referred to as like lifestyle diseases. And then on top of that, we're not sleeping, right? So our body repairs itself when we're sleeping. Mm-hmm. And it means that not only does it like repair, but it's doing all of these other processes. So there's this book by Dr. Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep. Highly recommend it.
Okay.
But he digs into the details of why sleep deprivation is contributing to these lifestyle diseases. One of the things he talks about is like 1 out of every 3 Americans are not getting the 7 hours of sleep that they need each night.
Oh,
and
baby. I need my
right?
8 hours. Come
Yeah.
on.
So I used to be a person who slept like 4 to 6 hours a night. Yeah, it was terrible. And now I sleep like 9 hours a night. And people like who knew me early in my career, like they don't believe me. They're like, no, you didn't need that much sleep. And I was like, oh yes, I actually did.
I was just lying to myself the whole time.
Yeah, I was. And your reaction levels, so like that ability to be kind, to be thoughtful, to be more strategic, my energy levels are way different. Yeah, sleep is huge. One of the things that really drives me too is like this issue with hyperconsumption in the US and how much that really affects us personally, but it also like our neighbors around the world. So when we look at like why we're hyper consuming, it's because we're so stressed and we're like trying to like satisfy this need because we're not living aligned to our values. And that's what makes it so difficult. So when we're living more aligned, we actually consume or like are more thoughtful about how we consume. And when we spend our time focused on experiences instead of just consuming things or like trying to keep up with the Joneses, we actually see a huge increase in our happiness levels too.
Nice. I imagine there are some challenges or hurdles that folks might experience in learning to share their values with other people. What could some of those challenges be?
Yes, there are a lot of challenges. And I think that it can be even more challenging for women. By the age of 6, girls already have gendered beliefs about their intelligence. And they've already been like, we're already starting to teach them like, hey, it's better to be agreeable than to vocalize what you really think. So for me, even, I look back at my childhood and I was definitely taught those things. And it's not my parents' fault. They did what they thought was best, right?
Well, they were socialized in the same system too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so, my mom would be like, well, you don't have to, even if you're right and they're wrong, like, don't really press it. You just kind of hold it, right?
Nah.
And like everybody
crash right through that door.
I mean, I think I did. I think that's why I got told that a lot. But yeah, like it's rude to disagree. You should always get along. Other people's needs should come before your own.
Classic challenge in career development for women, putting other people first.
And especially like as I see, I'm in my 30s, so a lot of my friends are having kids, and there's a lot of mom guilt out there where
mom
it's like
shame.
Mom shame too, yeah.
Oof.
So even them putting themselves first in the relationship and being like, hey, I need support in order to best take care of my kids. We have to be intentional about how we shift them. I think a really good way to think about this is, as you're starting to examine what you believe, and you're thinking about, okay, is this something that I would recommend to my best friend to do? Or would I want my daughter or my niece or the next generation of women to act this way? And if the answer is no, then we probably have a little reflecting to do. So the other big challenge is not coming across as defensive or preachy or aggressive as we're talking about what we value. And I think that this is something that especially early on when you're trying to, be more assertive about what you value, and you're also like telling yourself that sometimes it comes out in a way where you're like, I'm going to tell you what I think about this. And, like, that's great that you're starting to examine it, but it's not going to be received in a way that you probably want, right? And so the best way to really kind of overcome this challenge is to be really grounded in why you believe what you believe, because it doesn't really matter if they agree with you or not, right? It's if you're speaking and living authentically to who you are, what matters? You're the one who has to go to bed every night and live with the choices and the way you behaved and acted in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I have found particularly helpful with this is there is a loving kindness meditation, kind of been made famous by Sharon Salzberg. And in this practice, it really helps you to have care for yourself. It's like loving kindness towards yourself, but also others. So you can show up in a way where it's like, yeah, these are my values. Those are your values. We can still get along and we can still have good dialogue, but we don't have to come to the same conclusions. An important thing to remember about this is that you don't have to apologize for what you believe in, and you don't have to feel like you have to defend it. So I see this a lot with women where, they're writing an email, they tell you what their value is, or maybe they're putting up a boundary, and then they feel like they have to explain themselves.
Justify.
We don't have to justify. We don't have to explain unless you want to, right? But don't feel like you have to.
Excellent. All right. You've convinced us, right? You've convinced us to start sharing our values with others. How do we start the process of identifying our personal and professional values?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think the real answer is it takes time. It really does take some quiet self-reflection in order for you to start to understand what makes me feel good? What gives me energy? What are the activities that are draining? What do I hate doing? For me, some personal examples is making dedicated time to take care of yourself. This has been really hard for me to learn. So am I getting enough sleep? Like I mentioned earlier, am I making sure I'm eating balanced meals? Am I exercising? Am I saying no to things that I really just don't want to do? Another big one for me, we talked about this earlier with some of the trained behaviors that we have to undo, especially as women.
Yeah.
I was always trained to be the helper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
the obliger type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My value is tied to whether I helped enough people today or not whether I did what I wanted or what I needed to do. We know there's always going to be things that we're going to end up having to go to that might not align quite with our values. So the example I have is I got invited to the social function and I don't really want to go. It's on a Saturday afternoon, summer. I'd rather be hiking, right? But I know that I have to show up. And so instead of really leaning into the event in my helper mode, where I'm like, hey, can I bake cookies and help clean up and all this stuff? Instead, I'm really trying to think about what would make the event more enjoyable for me. And as I thought about that, taking a little quiet time and reflection, I'm like, oh, well, I'd rather bike there. I'd rather put things around the event that really are going to light me up so that this one event doesn't become kind of like a drag on my energy the whole day.
Excellent example. Now, to not drag on the show, we're going to take a moment for a brief sponsor break. We'll be right back.
Hi, Barbie here from Moonray, husband and wife indie pop duo. If you enjoy the intro music, we invite you to listen to our debut EP, Honeymoon, streaming now on all platforms. Visit www.moonray-music.com for more.
And we're back, talking with Bri Harrington about communicating your personal and professional values. Now, before the break, you were giving us some examples of communicating your personal values or how you might go about understanding them. Let's transition into some professional values. Give us a few examples to learn from.
Another great question. So earlier I was saying, our personal and professional lives are so intertwined, and I'm going to kind of link them up here. So a friend of mine works for an advertising agency. They're notorious for working long hours and people staying up late constantly, right? And they were talking about how every week they would have this little like hoorah rah about who stayed up the latest last night. You know, like, oh, right. Yeah. Like you stayed up until 2, like, thanks. Let's give her a round of applause. That's so wild, but it's pretty like normal in the advertising world. And it wasn't until like somebody stood up and said, we should not be celebrating this. Like there's actually something wrong with people staying up until 2 or 4 in the morning every night this week. It means that our systems are flawed, right? And it's because she had those personal values, maybe similar to mine, where, you know, you got to be getting your sleep, you got to be taking care of yourself. And hey, you know, if you have family or friends, you might also want to see them too. So this is where it's like, okay, standing up for what you believe in your professional life is actually standing up for what you believe in your personal life. So another example I have is, you know, I'm based in Minneapolis. I live about a mile from where George Floyd was killed. And one of my corporate clients, the president, a woman, was really struck by what was happening and wanted to make some changes in the way that they address diversity and inclusion in their company, wanted to send out a company-wide message, and to all, you know, all of their clients. And unfortunately, you know, this is a really hard space for some people. And so the CEO, the board members were concerned that by speaking up for what they believed in, that they could alienate some of their clients who are based in the South. And, you know, it's crazy to me that we're having these conversations, and then it's not crazy to me that we're having these kind of conversations. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, again, this is where your personal and professional lives, they're intertwined. Like, can you go to bed at night working for a company that wouldn't send that message? Those are the questions you got to be asking yourself. And luckily, in this case, you know, they ended up being able to talk through it. And they sent out the message. But even, you know, it's like that hesitation, like somebody had to stand up and say like, no, this is the right thing to do. Like we should be doing something. We should have been doing something before. So another one that we're seeing a lot of changes right now is using specific pronouns. And you've had a lot of people on talking about how important it is to, you know, ask what people's pronouns are and to use inclusive language, you know, maybe asking about their partner instead of like their husband or girlfriend.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that this is really important, but I think that there's, you know, probably a lot of people listening that are like, ooh, I would love to do that. Also, the person I work for is super old school. How's that gonna jive? And again, this is an opportunity where you get to ask yourself, am I speaking up for what I believe in? Am I living aligned to those values? And how can I state them in a way that comes from like a really grounded place, right? So that you can lead the way and like bridge the gap for people who maybe haven't gotten to that awareness yet.
Ooh, okay. All right. Speaking of awareness, what about when we're cruising through our lives and we suddenly realize that our values have changed?
This goes back to kind of that loving kindness meditation that I talked about earlier. Allowing yourself to be different than who you were 5 years ago and not judge yourself for it. You know, we're allowed to change. And this is also important because it's really easy for us to put people in boxes, right? We want people to be easy to digest. Like, oh, you're into this, right? Like, I understand who you are. You understand who I am, but it's all superficial, right? So when we allow ourselves to change, we also have more space to allow other people to change.
Since you are here advocating for all of us to be sharing our values with other people, what would you caution us could be the outcome if we choose not to share our personal or professional values?
The research out of Harvard backs up what we've been talking about this whole time, right? And there's a book by one of the researchers there. His name's Sean Acker. He wrote The Happiness Advantage. And his research shows that when we're living aligned to what we believe in our personal and professional lives, we're not only happier, but we make better choices for ourselves. So then we're healthier and we're actually more productive and outperform people who aren't living aligned to their values.
Ooh.
So right? So like you're thinking, I don't know, is this like really worth it? I think I'm probably doing fine. I'll just keep not really doing, because that might be uncomfortable, right? It might be uncomfortable to stand up in new ways or to assert yourself differently. But the research shows that when you're living aligned to these values, you increase your sales by like 37%. So if you're in sales, that seems like a pretty good thing. And then this carries over across all like types of professions. So even medical doctors, right? When they're living more aligned to their values, they come up with more creative solutions and they diagnose faster than those who aren't.
Nice. That is definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah. So like if you think about whatever you're doing in your day-to-day life, if you could be more productive, more creative in your solutions, how would that change what your day look like? What your evening look like?
Great question. I love that.
I'm wondering, what would you say some of your personal or professional values are?
Integrity is one of my core personal and professional values. You know, being true to myself, standing firm in my principles and my boundaries, and always showing up as my authentic self is really, really important to me. I believe that integrity is truly one of the things that we only ever earn ourselves. Our integrity goes with us through our entire lives, and it shows who we really are. And it's the only thing we really ever earn for ourselves. I personally and professionally believe that. So that's one of my super core values, and I try to live that and breathe that in all the things that I do. I want to help wrap this episode and have you share some resources with our audience as they start to identify and develop and share their personal and professional values.
The best thing to remember is that you are the best resource for you. Only you are going to know what really speaks truth to what your values are. A great way that you can do this is to, and this might sound kind of like morbid, but write your epitaph.
Oh,
how do you want to be remembered? You know, when you pass, and people get your obituary, is it going to be super easy for them to write that because you've been so assertive with who you are and what you believe? That seems like a good place to start. I've also found it really helpful to do that meditation, the loving kindness meditation, and to notice when you're feeling really good. When do you feel the best? Do more of that and let go of the things that you should be doing because they're probably draining you.
Should. Don't should yourself.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a could. Another option, you could hire a health and wellness coach. And another great resource I mentioned earlier is Sean Acker's The Happiness Advantage.
Which we will definitely link all of those things in our show notes, except for you as your best resource. You're just going to have to remember that. All right, now we're going to transition to our Femme fact for the day. As you all may recall from history class or the umpteen movies about it, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was what dragged us into World War II. 2 months later, President FDR signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the incarceration of over 100,000 American residents who were of Japanese descent living on the West Coast of the United States. The justification used was national security, of course, through the baseless assertion that Japanese Americans might be agents of espionage. To be clear, no person of Japanese American heritage was ever convicted of espionage during this time, and it's also worth noting that over 2/3 of Japanese Americans who were interned were American-born citizens, many of whom were children. Not much is known about the inner workings of the 10 concentration camps that existed during this internment, but that also has to do with the fact that many Japanese Americans who were imprisoned were of the Nisei generation, meaning that they were the children of Japanese immigrants or first-generation Americans. And they believed in traditional Japanese values like gamen, which means to endure with dignity, or shikata ganai, which loosely means it can't be undone or it is what it is. Now, once released from these internment camps, the Nisei generation tried their best to resume the lives they'd been living 3 years prior, while upholding their cultural beliefs, meaning that the injustices that they endured went unspoken, and shikata ganai was a reminder to just move on. This imprisonment of over 100,000 Japanese American citizens is barely, if at all, discussed in our history classes today because, as we've noted many times before in this segment, unpopular people or events often get edited out of history. And in this instance, America was the villain, and history prefers heroes. Enter the Sansei generation, or second-generation American-born, the children of the Nisei generation, who grew up just as the civil rights movement was moving at full speed. The Sansei generation recognized America's hostility toward their people as racial oppression, and they demanded justice for the crimes committed against their communities. One notable person of the Sansei generation was Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga. Aiko was an 18-year-old California high school student when the government issued the relocation order. Aiko was called to the principal's office where her principal told her that you're not going to get your diploma because your people bombed Pearl Harbor. From there, Aiko and her family were taken to Camp Manzanar in California, where they were overcrowded, undernourished, and stripped of their American-born rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness for 3 years. After being released, Aiko moved to New York and kept her head down, trying to survive in an America that was rife with anti-Asian sentiment. And this was the 1960s. Sound familiar? So in New York, she crossed paths with an activist group of Nisei women who were protesting the war and seeking reparations for their incarceration. This was a turning point for Aiko as she realized that she neither had to accept nor forget her trauma, and instead could seek justice for herself and her community. Aiko moved to Washington State, where she studied all documents related to the government's decision to imprison Japanese Americans. She eventually became like a human encyclopedia of all things Japanese concentration camp, and her extensive knowledge landed her a job as a researcher when Congress created a commission in 1981 tasked with investigating causes of wartime incarceration, as well as remedial recommendations. It was here that Aiko found the original Final Report on Japanese Evacuation from the West Coast by Lieutenant General John DeWitt, a U.S. Army general of the Western Defense Command during World War II. The version of the final report that the government submitted to the Supreme Court had said that General DeWitt's professional opinion was that there was insufficient time to separate the loyal Japanese Americans from the disloyal, so immediate military intervention of all Japanese Americans was required. The original document that Aiko found stated no such thing. Instead, it said that one could never separate the loyal from the disloyal, no matter how much time one had. Upon submitting this document to the commission, Aiko revealed that military officials, including the Assistant Secretary of War and a Solicitor General, had deliberately altered an official military report to create a document that would not undermine the prior War Department's relocation actions, thereby supporting the War Relocation Authority before the Supreme Court, which is to say, to uphold the military's decision to intern Japanese Americans legally. Apparently, there had been 10 original copies of General DeWitt's report, but they had all been mysteriously destroyed, and they were burned, by the way. People came out and figured everything out afterwards, except for that one copy that Aiko found. So we're talking about the deliberate forgery of an official document whose aim was the suppression of an entire cultural populace, then the subsequent cover-up of said document to hide military action that was later described by the commission as a decision to incarcerate people based on racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Aiko's discovery led to the reopening of 3 different Supreme Court cases where justice had been foiled, and thankfully later corrected. Reparations were also later paid out to the survivors, which is a whole different conversation and a way different femme fact. So, kind of a dark chapter in history here, I know, but if you take anything away from this history lesson, let it be this. Just as Aiko did, dig a little deeper next time you're faced with something odd, Because if a story seems too good to be true, it probably is. And in this instance, all it took was one woman, one brave woman with insatiable curiosity to change the course of justice for hundreds of thousands of American citizens. So who knows what you could uncover next? Bri, it has been an absolute pleasure visiting with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us.
Thank you so much. It's been just a delight.
The delight was all ours. Now, if you found this episode as delightful as I did, I kindly ask that you subscribe or follow our show. You can also connect with us by email, HERdacious@HERdacity.org, and you can visit us on socials. We are at HERdacity on all channels. Until next time, remember Aiko in your moments of struggle. Stay true to your personal and professional values because they can have a lasting impact, a ripple effect that you might never imagine. Poof.